Hello and welcome to Bar Snacks. Today I'm going to be talking about crowding out, why it happens, when it happens, how badly it happens, and I'm actually going to talk about a real case study coming from some real academic research that I found. Because we always need good examples when we're writing papers in economics, and good examples of crowding out are very, very, very hard to come by. But they're essential. So I found this especially interesting, so I'm going to touch on that as well with a case study from Malaysia. Let's start with point one, what is crowding out and how it works. So essentially, crowding out occurs when the government wishes to increase government spending as part of expansionary fiscal policy. Rufus from the future here, and I've just realized something while I'm editing this video about a mistake I've made. So I've said at the beginning that crowding out occurs with loans, which is true, from expansionary fiscal policy and government spending, which is true, but it can also happen for resources. It's the same concept applicable across many things. So the analysis I do later in this video isn't actually specifically on loans, which I'm just realizing as I'm editing this. It's just simply about the presence of government sector firms impeding on the investment levels of private firms. But it's the same concept, it's still applicable, it's just not specifically about loans. Thank you. When the government needs money to increase government spending, they can take loans from commercial banks. Now, here I have a graph for the loan market, and when the government decides to take out loans from commercial banks, it essentially increases the demand for loans. So we get an increase from D1 to D2 on the graph. Now, because of the way it works, when there's higher demand for loans, banks are naturally going to demand higher interest rates, and so we get interest rate rises from IR1 to IR2 as according to the market mechanism. We would expect this, and the specific effects that this has is decreased consumption and investment in the economy because there is increased saving. Because you can now get a higher nominal interest rate, a better rate of return on the savings, people's marginal propensity to save, or the marginal rate of leakage, is going to increase, and there's going to be decreased consumption and investment, which is what they otherwise could have done with the money. This means overall there's going to be decreased aggregate demand, as consumption and investment are constituents of aggregate demand. This is a detriment to potential and actual growth. So when we have increases in aggregate demand, yes, it increases on the demand side, but it also has knock-on effects on the supply side. So when we invest more and companies grow because of our investments, they can afford to employ more workers, and the potential growth of the entire nation can shift, as well as the actual growth just shifting from the regular increase in aggregate demand when we're not at full employment. So there's not necessarily a decrease overall, but it is a detrimental effect. It won't increase as much because of crowding out. Now, the specific example that I have found is from Malaysia. And Malaysia implemented expansionary fiscal policy because of a few macroeconomic factors. So firstly, they had budget deficit issues in that they weren't receiving enough on taxation. And they also had the 1MDB scandal, which heavily drained the coffers of the Malaysian government. It's a fantastic scandal. I've read about it extensively. It's a very interesting book. You should really check that out. $1 Billion Whale is an account of the scandal. But because of this, they implemented expansionary fiscal policy, and crowding out has actually occurred in Malaysia. Now, this was extremely fascinating to me when I found this example, because crowding out is not nearly as tangible as other forms of fiscal or monetary policy. Let's say increasing taxes. It's because increasing taxes is obvious, so people have less to spend. It's a very clear effect. But crowding out is much more nuanced and much less tangible. So when I found this research, it was very interesting. Now we're going to go over it. Right. So now I want to look at this paper. A government-linked corporations crowding out private investment in Malaysia. This was published by the Asian Development Bank in April 2013. And a lot of it is looking at the GLC presence, which is government-linked corporations, specifically in Malaysia, and the theory of crowding out basically in a lot of detail. This is not relevant at all. These are stats about different companies in the Malaysian economy, so not actually relevant to what we're trying to look for. This is the theory. Here are some graphs. Here is an explanation of the model. I don't actually understand this, but it's not relevant. And here we are to the actual interesting bit of this research. We can see that here that there's a table of figures. What we're really interested in is the GLC share figure. And I'm just going to talk about some of the explanation surrounding this table so we can understand it a little bit. On the other hand, the coefficient for GLC share of revenues in an industry is negative, suggesting that the strong GLC presence in an industry reduces the amount of investment undertaken by other firms in the same industry. Essentially, the more government-linked corporations that there are in an industry, it reduces the amount of investment undertaken by other firms. This is the exact relationship that I described previously, and we have actual quantified, substantiated proof here. I'm going to move on. Our results show that in industries where GLC firms are dominant, the coefficient is significant and negative. However, in industries where GLC firms are not dominant, the coefficient is not significant. You can see here in the table, this is an overall figure, this fixed effects column. This is for industries with more government corporations, this is for industries with less. We can see here that the figure for GLC share, while both negative and looking quite similar, in fact, we can see here that it's significant at a 10% level for GLC dominant industries and not for GLC non-dominant industries. So although I don't really understand a lot of this, I can see from this results table alone and a little subtle analysis reading around it that there is proof that crowding out is happening. In Malaysia, there's substantiated evidence, and this is really, really cool to see. Well, it's not great for Malaysia, obviously, but it's really good for backing up this kind of work that we do in class when it's not so obvious. Right now, crowding out is a big problem for Malaysia, and I want to show you expressly why from this news article. Malaysia enjoys full employment, country can attain high income status in 2 years, Mahathir. So Mahathir is the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and he said that the unemployment rate stood at 3.3% last year, and this was effectively full employment. Obviously, full employment, you're going to have the natural rate of unemployment from frictional unemployment, etc., and structural unemployment from advances in technology. But he's essentially saying that the country is producing a full employment. Now let's go back to the graph and see why this is an especially big problem for Malaysia. Why is this especially bad for Malaysia? Well, Malaysia is looking to become a high-income country within a few years. It's experiencing a large level of potential and actual growth, so that is where the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts and aggregate demand shifts along with it, causing movement along the real GDP axis. And it's very close to full employment. What that means is private sector spending is very high. So that means that an increase in interest rates has more private sector investment and consumption to crowd out. This means that this change, right, is going to be more significant in relation to Malaysia's aggregate demand levels. Because resources are mostly employed, the government has to offer a better rate to banks, essentially, in order to secure loans, which means that the demand is going to increase more, the interest rate is going to increase more, and the potential detrimental effects to aggregate demand and to potential and actual growth are going to be so much bigger. Anyway, I just made this video because I thought this was a really interesting topic. I really enjoyed looking into this and thought I should share it with everyone, so thank you so much. I've been Barsnax. See you next time.